Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the ESU Happy Hour. Today's presentation is about port wines with Dr. Phil Williams. My name is Dr. Karen Blair Brand, and I am the committee chair for the ESU Happy Hour Committee and president of the ESU Central Pennsylvania Branch. I would like to give you a big thank you to the ESU Charlottesville Branch for sponsoring today's happy hour. Ideas for our happy hour lectures basically come from ESU members and viewers like you. At the end of the program, you will receive a survey in your email where you are encouraged to share your feedback on tonight's program or lecture. And you're also welcome to share your ideas for upcoming happy hour lectures. There will be a question and answer session at the end, and you may submit your questions via the chat module. You may also identify yourself and your branch if you would like. You can also add comments, as Dr. Phil Williams would like you to comment throughout, and we will read those comments during the Q&A session. You will be able to find the chat module at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You may submit these questions anytime during the presentation. However, we will read the questions or the comments in the order that they have been received. Today, I would like to say that we have over 173 members registered for the Port Wines presentation, and that's great. I would also like to give a big shout to the branches with the most registered members, and those branches are the Charlottesville branch, yay, Central Florida, and Greenwich. Dr. Phil Williams, and finally, I'm going to introduce him. Dr. Phil Williams, president of the ESU Charlottesville Branch, who will share his expertise with us today about all his knowledge about port wines. A little bit about Dr. Williams. Dr. Williams is an adjunct professor at the Institute of World Politics in Washington, D.C. He also teaches at the International Relations Department of Koç University in Istanbul, Turkey. He has worked in the Mediterranean and in Turkey extensively. Phil also worked in corporate finance on Wall Street. Dr. Williams recently published a book, Turkey and America, East and West, Where the Twain Meet. He has also authored many news articles about Turkey and its domestic and international affairs. Phil has been an ESU member for over 23 years and has provided branch programming for over 18 years. He has also been active in the ESU Shakespeare and TLAB programs for many years. He has presented the ESU US, he represented the ESU US in ceremonies in Istanbul, Turkey, when this branch was opened and when it was set up. So thank you, Phil. Phil is president of the ESU Charlottesville Branch a second time, and he has been able to increase their branch membership from 70 to about 126 members currently. Phil, take it away. Thank you very much, everyone.
All right, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Loud and clear.
All right. Well, I just wanted to say how pleased I am that you all could join me this afternoon. I'd like to begin by wishing you a happy new year to all of you across the fruited plain. In the context of my talk today, I use the word fruited advisedly. So this is a lot of fun to do live. It's a little bit more challenging, to say the least, to do it by Zoom, not having some of the interaction and commentary that I otherwise would have when I have done these things a few times over the last dozen years or so. But anyway, I'm looking forward to this, and I've surrounded myself with a lot of delicious props, and I will share them visually with you. But let me begin by talking very briefly about what the branch has been doing. As Karen noted, in the last couple of years, we have raised the branch membership back up to record height, actually over 50% in 2 years. And I am supported by a very strong board and strong committee chairs. It's been exciting to work with them and to see the branch doing as well as it's doing. I can mention just a couple of things in connection with our philanthropies. We were fortunate to have the runner-up, the second place national finisher in the Shakespeare contest. And thanks to a grant from a couple of our members, a member and his wife, we've been able to add prize monies for the first, second, and third winners for our branch contest down here, which is terrific. So on the T-Lab side, the applicant that we accepted 3 years ago, because of COVID, she was finally able to go over to the UK and study. And she went to Oxford, and she came back. She was thrilled. Our Shakespeare contest winner, just thrilled. And I encourage you to visit the Charlottesville website. We've expanded it a lot, lot more content in it and stories, and there are testimonials from both the Shakespeare winner and from our T-Lab person. Now, we had an extraordinary gift given to us by a member last fall, and that has allowed us to expand our T-Lab reach. It was all our branch could do for many, many years to raise the money to send a teacher every other year. We can now quite comfortably send 2 teachers every year with the grant that we received last fall. So that's terrific. If there were 3 people that were outstanding, we could swing that as well. So that's a great new dimension here at the Charlottesville branch. So that's enough for the promo about the Charlottesville branch, but I couldn't do it without a strong board and committee members. They've just been terrific. So let me just go on now and share with you a little bit about my port story. How did I get interested in this to begin with? I would say it was in the 1970s, grad school. In my mid to late 20s, there was a very good wine store in Cambridge. I had already become quite interested and serious about wine and cooking, both, at that point. And they had a terrific collection of ports, and I began to sample them, became fascinated with them. Fast forward 1985, 15 months after baby 1 arrived, and a few months before our baby 2 arrived, Marilyn and I took a trip to Portugal. And we had visited a number of places, but had really targeted Oporto itself. And I went, and it was in March. There were, no tourists to speak of that we could even tell. And we went to the Taylor Fladgate, which factory or port lodge, and I was particularly fond of their ports, both Tawny and their vintage, and introduced myself. And lo and behold, we met the general manager, who had a quintessentially wonderful British name. He was Jeremy Bull, and he invited us in. And before we were through, we tasted 7 vintage ports going back to 1935. This is 1985. Then we were invited to lunch in the lodge, in his quarters. And I think this is a point in which I think those of you that haven't already started should now join me, because I'm going to start where I discovered, I wasn't aware of this, of white port. So I'm just going to add a little bit of what was recommended to me there. I have a nice cold white port here with an orange in it. You could do it soda, quinine, or you can drink it straight. White port is actually made in both dry, but more characteristically and typically in a sweeter mode. So it's a wonderful summer drink. You have it chilled, have it on the ice, have it with your favorite fruits, or have it neat, as it were. So let me begin with introducing white port and saying to you all, cheers. I've discovered over the years that you might assume that white port was more of a lady's choice, but I've over the years, having done this 5 or 6 times, maybe, I find it quite a few men that enjoy white port and white port cocktail. So I think at this point, let's jump in to the presentation. May we have the first slide? So, by the way, feel free, as Karen said, if you have questions, that's great. If you just like to comment on the wine, my descriptions of the wine, or anything else, you can certainly leave a comment there, and some of those will be shared, I hope, during the Q&A. So you might agree with me, disagree with me, you might be crazy about something. Feel free of these 5 styles of port. Feel free to share your reactions and thoughts in the chat room. So I open here with this classic poster from the 1930s, the Sandeman House. The Sandemans, in fact, were primarily a Scots family who became involved in the early part of the 19th century in the port business, port and sherry, and this is an iconic poster. Next slide. So how did port wine, how did it come to be known as the Englishman's wine? If you can see on your screen there, that lovely collection of things to eat and share with various ports, it says a Portuguese creation, a British discovery, an American passion. So I forthrightly accept all of those. It's definitely, the American market has grown substantially in recent decades, and the price is reflecting that. It was a lot less expensive when, even inflation adjusted, when I started introducing myself to various ports. So when we say it's an Englishman's wine, let me also bring to your attention, some of you have been to church or go to church and have taken communion. And with the popularity of port wine carried around the globe by the British, it so happens that typically communion wine in the Anglican Church and the Episcopal Church is diluted port wine. So this Englishman's wine is a very interesting concept, and it happens over the 18th century. We'll talk about how it happens. Next slide. So the British history probably goes back as far as crusaders, many of whom were second and third sons, and under British primogeniture rules, they didn't have much to look forward to in returning home. And it turned out that a few knights, a few squires, and a few well-armed, well-trained people could basically take command of various castles and ports along the Mediterranean. So as the Crusaders were forced out of Israel, Palestine, and eventually Turkey. They moved to Malta, they moved to Rhodes and then to Malta, and they settled in various places on the Spanish coast, and they settled on the Portuguese coast. So you have British people occupying some of these coastal towns on the way back to England, and they preferred the weather where they settled to the weather in the UK. So you can see here from this history that between the 11th and 13th centuries, Crusaders essentially wrest control of Portugal from the Moors. Now that's not King Richard and the people that went to the Near East and the Holy Lands. These are basically French and Spanish people who fought to regain control of the Iberian Peninsula, which had been lost to the Moors pretty much from the early 8th century for a period of 600 years or so. Their strength was decreasing already by 1070, but it's during that period that the Moors are eventually pushed out and Crusaders and other Christians regain control of these areas. And by 1373, England signs its oldest treaty of friendship with Portugal. Winston Churchill would call on that treaty together with the 1654 treaty you see below, and basically announce to the King of Portugal during World War II, who was trying desperately to remain neutral during the war, announced to them that by virtue of that treaty, the British Navy has every right to coal its naval fleet in the Azores, which were owned by Portugal. So it was a bit problematic for the king, but Churchill was determined, and the British used, probably only Winston Churchill would know that there was a treaty going back to the 14th century that he could activate for the purposes of winning a war. You can see in 1474, there are already records that attest to the lively sales of what they called Portugal Red to England. By 1703, it's the beginning of the story of how port becomes the Englishman's wine. I don't need to tell the English-speaking Union members and guests that the love-hate relationship between the English, the British, and the French is about 1,000 years, was probably 1,000 years old or older. And this particular time, England went to war with Spain over the Spanish succession, and they ended up placing a 33% duty on claret, that is, on Bordeaux wines, which in due course made the Portugal Red sales begin to grow dramatically, especially amongst the Whigs. Some Tories and some Catholics who could afford it continued to drink claret, but decade by decade, tastes shifted to Portugal Red. By the way, it was not fortified at that time. It was just red Portuguese wine from the Douro Valley, at the foot of which is the city of Oporto on the Atlantic. The next big relationship interface between the British and Portugal is occasioned by the war with Napoleon. And by 1805, you can see Lord Nelson has this stunning victory over the French fleet, the Battle of Trafalgar. And in 1806, France, under Napoleon's lead, invades Spain and Portugal, and commences what's known as the Peninsular War. That is the Iberian Peninsula, which is Spain and Portugal. By 1812, Sir Arthur Wellesley, later dubbed Lord Wellington, boots the French out. But while they were in Portugal and before they were able to move over the mountains successfully into Spain, the troops had firsthand experience of port wine. Again, probably the vast majority of what they had was unfortified, that is, with no brandy added, but they developed a further fondness for Portuguese wine, rather like the doughboys did for French wine in World War I, and people who fought coming up from Africa in World War II into Italy became enamored of Chianti and Italian wines. Same thing happened to the troops here. I will tell you that while I was having lunch with Marilyn and I were having lunch with Jeremy Bull, being introduced to chilled white port with tonic. We also discovered that salty things go well with white port, but not so well with red. So we had, what did he give us before our lunch? He gave us green Spanish olives, and essentially English crisps. I have here represented as American kettle chip. So the saltiness classically goes with the white port. And while having lunch, I reached and pulled a dusty volume off this wall-to-wall library shelves. These were the quartermaster records of Wellington's troops in Portugal. I happened to flip the page open, and the soldiers were being reminded that they were guests in the country of Portugal and to desist from taking advantage of young Portuguese women and to try to control their thirst for Portuguese wine. So it was quite a lunch, quite a conversation, quite an opportunity for us that sort of boosted our level of involvement with port. Next slide, please. So here we have the British forces getting over the top of the mountains at the top of where the Douro River, actually the watershed, is in Spain. And they get over the mountains, begin to defeat Napoleon's troops, famously at the Battle of Salamanca in 1812. Next slide. So, port wine, Douro River Valley. Where are the names come from? What are they? Porto is basically named from the Roman name. The Romans called it Porto Cale in the 4th century AD. They were the ones that introduced vines into the Douro River Valley, planting of viticulture. The Romans were responsible for that. And the river Douro is about 475 miles long, going up from the Atlantic into Spain. And the Douro is basically thought to probably be of Celtic origin, the name, and it's similar to Dover-on-Dore in England. So Dover-on-Dore and Douro were probably Celtic words that the Romans discovered when they got there, that this is what the local people called it. Now, if you look at that river from Porto, the lodges and the port wine trade takes place opposite from the main urban city of Porto, Oporto. It takes place on the other side of the mouth of the river. in Villa Nova de Gaia. Funny story about that, how that happened, but it was originally all the business was in Porto, and the Catholic Church was involved in collecting certain revenues associated with the trade. But then it was decided that it would be terrific if all these factories and lodges were moved out of the central city, much to the dismay of the Catholic Church, because they no longer were able to collect revenues, but the city was able to move the working side of the trade and business to the other side of the mouth of the river. One needs to travel about 60 miles upstream, as it were, to the east to get to the actual Douro Valley, and one needs to go there. The river is divided in the Baia and Cima and Alto Corgo. It's the lower, the middle, and the upper reaches of the Douro River. The higher up you go on the river, the higher the elevation, the hotter the soil, the hotter the soil gets, and the finer wines. The wine area begins on the map at Regua or Lamego, sort of central part of the Cima or middle part of the river is at Pinhao, Pinhao, you see there. And as you move up into the Alto Douro, you get into some of the finer wines or vineyards, which are called quintas. So that next slide. So you can just take a look at this. The average incline for the terraces for port wine is about 30 degrees. That is very steep. All those terraces and originally walls were done by hand until the early 1800s. Began to be able to move some steam equipment in there and to begin to cut some of those terraces. The work, next slide. The work is backbreaking. As you see from this quotation here from the Quinta de San Antonio's Armando Almeida, what he has to say about the conditions under which they struggle to produce great wine here. The soil has schist or schistose in it, and it's basically set vertically, not horizontally. So cutting it down to cultivate and to plant is cutting essentially into vertical rock. But the vertical rock, the schist, is a blessing, on the other hand, because when the vines start to lay down their roots go down these vertical schist plates, and they grow very deep in the soil. And therefore, when it seems hot and dry and grapes should be dying on the vine, it's so hot and so dry. The vines have grown, the roots grow very deeply on these terraces, and they maintain contact with subsurface water to keep them going. As I say, the higher up you go, the quintas, the vineyards higher up are higher elevations, get hotter, drier, lower rainfall, more intense wines. Next slide. So the point I'm making here, some of you may be familiar with this, strategic commodities such as wool, cod, caviar, cotton, sugar, rum, or oil bring trade patterns with them, extraordinary cultural exchange, and sometimes conflict and war, probably more than sometimes. Port wine is no exception. So how did port rather than claret become a matter of patriotism for many English? Next slide. Well, here you can see Jonathan Swift, this great lexicographer and writer, a little ditty here. And you can see how he's basically saying, this is the Treaty of Methuen kicks in 1703. So 1710, 20, and 30, Jonathan Swift is writing. And he's basically saying, you'd be more patriotic if you would support wines from Portugal than wines coming from our enemy of France. Be sometimes to your country true, have once the public good in view. Bravely despise champagne at court and choose to dine at home with port. A clear Whig sentiment, to be sure. But then again, the Scots always maintained, as you know, a special relationship with the French. It took a little bit longer for the Catholic Church to be completely displaced by the Protestant Church, the Church of England, etc. So you can see the next slide will give you the Scottish take on the same subject. Next slide. So what this shows you is that there was not a uniform preference through the British Isles to make the French pay, and to be patriotic would mean to drink port wine and stay at home and not be extravagant. But it was certainly the Whig Party sentiment at that time. And that price difference over the course of 100 years finally brings us to port being referred to as the Englishman's wine. Next slide. The great lexicographer Samuel Johnson, notes on rank ordering spirits. I'll let you read it for yourself. The happy compromise in the case of port, as you will see when I discuss how it's actually made today and how it's been made for primarily since the 1820s, a more uniformly fortified drink rather than just plain Portuguese red wine or white wine. So the nice thing about port, of course, is that it is like sherry and like Madeira. It's the best of both worlds. It's grape juice fermented, to which the fermentation is stopped before all of the residual sugar is gone in the grape, leaving some residual sweetness. It is stopped happily by grape brandy. So drinking port actually allows you to accomplish both objectives. Next. So here are the basic varietals. There are lots of varieties of grapes there, but primarily the better wines are made with the varietals I've noted here. And that fortification was well established by the early 1800s, including sherry and Madeira. To some extent, it was discovered by accident. These wines in general for shipping in the 18th century, sometimes to stabilize the wine, brandy would be poured on top of the cask as it was just before it was loaded into the hull of a ship. These hogsheads that the wine was transported in were used as ballast in the ship going one way, and the more, as you sold off the wine from port to port, like the British East India Company trading all the way out to India and back again, for example, you would simply have to replace those hogsheads with stone for ballast. But you can see here that how a pipe, by the way, that's about 145 gallons. So you can see how the growth of this Portugal red wine eventually begins to take off by the late 19th century. Next slide. So, as I've told you here, the grapes are transported down the Douro from the quintas in the middle and upper reaches of the Douro, death-defyingly in these ships that you see that were traditionally used before the advent of train alongside the river and now roadways. They're called barco rabelos, and any number of people lost their lives in the cataracts at various levels as you came down the river towards the mouth from the upper reaches of the river. Port was lost, people were lost. In fact, the white port that I'm drinking tonight is called Ferreira. Ferreira is the name of the surname, married surname of Dona Antonio Ferreira, who was married into one of the port house lodge owners, families, port producers and shippers. And she is pretty much a 19th century character. By the mid 19th century, she'd gone through 2 husbands and then she married the second husband was the wealthiest man in Portugal, which helped their business dramatically. And then he died. She married her vineyard manager and was an extraordinary influence on the port wine trade. And she is Dona Ferreira. And so here these wines are being shipped down the Douro. The grapes they're brought into the lodges. In the old days, they were all crushed underfoot. In lagares is what they're called, in these cement vats. Today, they are crushed with machines, with the exception of vintage ports. The best vintage ports are still done by this traditional method. It takes 2 or 3 days. These people have to be fed, and they tread and they tread and they tread and they tread, and some get out, and others go in, and they drink until they're ready to fall into the juice, and they get out and they're replaced. But it's a very labor-intensive process, but it's still considered the best process. Now, how do you make a fortified port? As I say, they had put port on the top of hogsheads, probably back in the 1600s, sometimes to just stabilize the wine. In this case, the brandy is actually infused into the grape juice. And it's 4 parts to 1 part brandy. If you allowed the grapes to completely ferment out at 14 or 15%, the wine would be dry. You arrest the fermentation of the grape juice by introducing 77% grape brandy alcohol, which immediately stops the fermentation process. That's typically done when there are 3 or 4 or 5, depending on the style of port you have, degrees of alcohol that would have otherwise turned from sugar to alcohol. It gets stopped, it gets arrested, so residual sweetness is left in the wine. That's a fortified wine. All of things being equal, the same as happens to Spanish sherry and to Portuguese Madeira. That's how you stop fermentation preserve residual sugars and therefore sweetness. Is port wine sweet? Yes, sort of. I qualify it because if it were just sweet, it would never have become as popular and as expensive and as desirable as it became. The better ports have tannic acids in them, plus tannins from wood in the case of cask aged ports that create an acidic balance to that sugar, so that there's nothing cloyingly sweet about Porto, although some people say it's too sweet for me. But there are horses for courses, and there are times when a slightly sweet wine that's beautifully balanced with acidity can't be beat. Next slide. So we have the subject of wood ports here. So tonight I have for wood ports, these are wines that are basically kept in large wooden barrels, aged in the barrels. You can see the difference between a ruby and a tawny. Tawny spend a little bit more time in wood, than ruby. Ruby grapes are picked from vineyards that have slow maturing grapes in fermentation, have very bright red color, and are very fruit forward. So the wines, the grape varietals that are used to produce rubies, which again are blended, different age is in the barrel, but they're generally speaking 3 to 4 years in a barrel before bottled. And because the grapes that are selected are fruit forward and bright in color, they tend to keep that color in the wine. The wine is a little sweeter, has a little less wood and tannins to counter that sweetness, greatly loved by many. And I have here for the tastings, I tend to do ruby versus tawny, because they're both cask-aged wood ports. Rubies are younger, as I say, have the tawny port grape doesn't have to be as fruit forward. It can mature more quickly, because the interest there is to marry it more with the wood, and you end up with a very different color and a different taste. The ruby, cherry fruits for sure, floral, ripe plums, and the tawny. The tawny gets its name for the color. It's mahogany. It's been in that wood much longer. It's closer to brown, and it has that additional wood flavor, which lots of people like, including me. I happen to, all other things equal, I prefer tawny to ruby, but if you're cooking, ruby is the better wine for cooking. We can talk about that. How do you make a lovely reduction when you're serving a goose at Christmas, as I am wont to do, with dried fruits and the goose renderings and goose stock, fortified, as it were, with port, and I do it with ruby port, not tawny. So I don't know what you have in front of you, because I can't tell. Tawny, less cherry, a little more dark fruit, little caramel, little toffee. These are the things that come from that marriage, the longer marriage with the wood. Now, I should say that I won't be able to do it until after the presentation, but I have here a number of goodies. I can't really show them, but things to have with port in general. Walnuts, not salted. Dried fruits like apricots. They're excellent. With Tawny and with vintage, little mince pies, mincemeat pies. You can't go wrong with a late bottle vintage or vintage and chocolate. It just is a natural marriage. And then, of course, quintessentially, I have here a blue vein cheese. You could use gorgonzola. It's also wonderful, but preferably an English Stilton. Marries beautifully with late bottle vintage and vintage. So let me move on to the bottom. You see the late bottle vintage here is blended again, cask aged a little bit longer with wines from a particular year, but not quite a vintage quality. So sometimes the decisions about a year and a half after the grapes are crushed, decisions are made as to whether or not the wines are of a quality to even produce vintage port. Some of the also rans are noted very close to being of that quality. So they are watched over that 4, 5, 6 years, and are actually kept separate, as though they were from a vintage. They're put in wood, but they are kept separately, and they are taken out, as it says here, 5, 6, 7 years. They'll take that vintage-like wine, and it has the advantage of not having to decant it. It has the advantage of not having to wait as long as one should wait for a vintage port, as I'll explain later. So from a price standpoint, to get a vintage-like wine for a third of the price of a vintage wine, not have to fool with decanting, not having to wait forever. Late bottle vintage commercially has proven very successful, but it's literally that. It's a wine that doesn't quite make the grade for vintage. Not every year does Portugal produce wines of a quality to call them vintages. Sometimes the vintages are so obviously terrific, they are universally declared by all the port houses. Sometimes there are different producers, Taylor, Fladgate, Fonseca, Sandeman, Graham's, somebody that says that their grape juice is of vintage quality, even if everybody else is not so obviously so. So you'll find some years where vintage wines are produced by a real minority of the port houses, but they believe that their wine was exceptional, even though the average wine was not exceptional from that year. So next slide. So the invention of the glass bottle that could be laid on its side for slow aging, a secret largely lost to Europe since the Falernian, so appreciated by Horace in Rome, as I say. Yeah, the 1600s, they start producing glass bottles. You would probably know them by the term flagon. And they were not, they were fat bottomed and were not intended to store wine, for long periods of time. With the invention of the perfectly cylindrical bottle with a narrow neck and the discovery of cork and long cork in the case of port, or other wines that are expected to be aged for a very long period of time, have slightly longer corks. It was discovered that these wines could become brilliant, but they had to be left on their sides for considerable periods of time while they would mature ever so slowly through the tiniest amounts of air that would get through a cork. The liquid couldn't get through it, but air would. They would age and they could be laid down. This was the big development in the 1700s, which eventually lent itself very famously to champagne, where they had learned how to make glass that was stronger, that could deal with the gas inside the champagne, but where they could, with nice corks, properly placed corks, you could lay a wine down, a vintage port down, or any other great red wine with serious body, tannic acid, aging capacity. You could lay them down. This lent itself very well to the evolution of literally brilliant vintage ports. But you will see here, it normally would take, the rule of thumb is 18 years. That's a long time to wait, which is why Tawny ports, ruby ports, and late bottle vintage ports are less expensive and more popular and more widely sold. As you can see at the bottom, only about 3% of the crop produces a juice that is considered adequate to be claimed to be vintage. Next slide. And then there are they're hybrids here that again, I would say mostly for commercial purposes. For commercial purposes, I would say that these are created to find little places in the interstices of market demand to meet particular tastes and cost preferences. So a single quinta is a wine that the wine is made from the grapes of one vineyard only. I happen to have a beautiful bottle of 1992 single quinta Guaymarans vintage port. Then crusted port, poor man's port, 2 years in oak, then bottled, ready to drink after 5 or 6 years of bottle aging. You don't put the best of your juice into these bottles. So you get a little bit of wood. They're probably pretty fruit forward, and put them in a bottle and sell about 5 or 6 years, and hence the name poor man's port. Colheita means it comes from a particular harvest. That is a particular year, aged in wood 7 or more years, with characteristics of tawny. Bottles should have 2 dates, both the harvest and the bottling years on them. That's colheita. And then you have another variation here, reserve ports, which are a blend of premium quality wine aged in wood for 7 or more years, but has no date. So it's not quite as good as a late bottle vintage where you've actually tracked, it's not a blend, you've actually put juice that didn't quite qualify for vintage, but you put it and kept it separately, and you decide at the end of 5 or 6 years that it's so good that you're going to take it out of wood. So there and put it in a bottle. That's a late bottle vintage. Reserve port is similar, little less expensive because of the qualifications I note here. Next slide. So here they are on your screen, beginning with white port, ruby, tawny, late bottle, and vintage. Next slide. So there are traditions in serving these wines. Many of them come from the English Navy. And the port gets poured. Here's mine, 1820, 1830, 1840, 3-ring antique port decanter. It gets passed in a clockwise fashion. And so I don't know if any of you have late bottle vintage or vintage that you're drinking today, but I think when you put them up, it will only be the vintage that goes into that decanter. The late bottle vintage not needing to be decanted. Late bottle vintage is very dark looking, but not as dark and not as intense as the vintage. Heavenly, divine. Next slide. You know that when you pass these decanters around a table, sometimes it takes a long time, especially if people pour their own glasses. Others to your left have finished theirs, and you get involved in a lot of conversation and you fail to pass the decanter. So the expression there is, sir, the ship is very long, meaning please move the port. Or an even funnier one, my good sir, do you know the Bishop of Norwich? The Bishop of Norwich was a bishop in the first half of the 19th century. As he got older, of course, he would be invited by his parishioners from lunch, and they would sit afterwards and have port. And the older he got, the slower he was about moving the port around the table, so much so that he was, in his dotage, he was known to nod off with the decanter sitting in front of him. So if you're hogging the port and you don't move it, sometimes the question is, do you know the Bishop of Norwich? Next slide. Port and family traditions. Laying down ports for one's children at their birth. Generally not to be opened before their 18th birthday. The 1980s produced 2 universally declared vintages, 1983 and 1985. Only 2 were universally declared. Just read the last thing on this slide there, and you will understand why Marilyn and I laid down a case of each of 83 and 85 for our children. We have had more fun, and I will tell you, they watched, by the time they were 12 years old, 13, they were watching me decant at Christmas or Thanksgiving. They know how to properly decant or salvage a wine where the cork breaks up and so forth and so on. But the cute story I'll tell you very quickly is that when Margaret turned 18, we opened her 1983 vintage port, Taylor Fladgate. 2 years later, Phillips turned 18, and we opened the 1985 Grahams. Both were said to be the best of their year. 1 year later, the children came home at Christmas and said, Dad, we want to taste off. He said, my daughter said, I know my 83 is better than my brother's 85. And he said, no way. So we carefully decanted these things early Christmas morning. We checked on them in the afternoon. We enjoyed them with Stilton cheese at dessert time, and kept a little oat for the following morning to see if, make sure we had given full judgment and fair judgment to each. The agreement the following morning, the day after Christmas, is that it was a tie. Next slide. So yeah, there's port for medicinal purposes. Next slide. Here you use Sandeman Port marketing in the 1930s. This is the Scottish firm. There, you can read it. Next slide. And then there's drinking port, a little bit beyond the medicinal usage here. You see here in Hogarth. It may not be addressing issues of health, but quite possibly, arguably, was helping the soul. Next slide. So here are some port fanciers of note. Dr. Samuel Johnson. You can see the amounts in the good old days that these people consumed regularly. I'll just let you read them. Next slide. So here's some special vintages. Currently, the youngest highly touted vintage is 2017. So you could put one of these down for a grandchild, for example. Going back in time, those were very special vintages, and you can see our children's birth years in them, the 85s and 83s. Classics were 1954, 1904, 1900, and maybe the best, 1927, in the Roaring 20s. What happened? Well, people didn't know this because by the time the wine was declared a vintage, was removed from the casks and put into bottle and got to market, we were in the midst of the Depression. So people only discovered many, many years later, most generally speaking, after World War II, they discovered that the 27 was fabulous. And the last one here is the Waterloo port of 1815, which, as I say, at the bicentennial in 2015, recently, Sotheby's auctioned a Ferrera, I told you about her, at the Tower of London for 6,800 euros. It was noted that no French were present. Next. How long can a port be kept? Here's what Wyndham Fletcher, I think it's my favorite single book. Wyndham Fletcher's classic book. I mean, it was published in the mid-70s, but it's a fabulous book about port, the families, the wine, how it was made, history, the great characters, and so forth. So he basically says, you know, if you lay it down, a great port, when you're born, it'll see you out. So properly aged, carefully aged, ports can go a very long time. The oldest one in my cellar right now is 1970. Next. So in victory, you deserve port. In defeat, you need it. I thank you all so much for sharing a passion of mine, history, politics, war, and a fabulous wine that becomes even more beautifully developed with the introduction of fortification, making it a stable, elegant, extraordinary, highly prized wines. Thank you all. Cheers again, and Happy New Year. That's a wrap.
Okay, let's get to some of the questions here for you, Phil. The first one is from M. Wang, and they asked, which are your favorite labels now in the Duo region, particularly from smaller vineyards?
Well, if you're actually talking about just a vineyard, then you're actually talking about an individual quinta.
Yeah, the Douro region they're asking about.
No, the Douro region is what we're talking about today.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Right.
the answer is this: if it's very difficult, Vesuvio, Guayamarans are two single quinta, single vineyard ports, which historically have been absolutely outstanding and elegant. So my answer is, here's an example of two: the Guayamarans and Vesuvio are two single quinta, Douro, single vineyard, vintage ports.
Okay. The next question is from Charles Lumpkins from the Central Pennsylvania branch. He asked, is brandy the only substance that best fortifies port? Were other alcoholic and non-alcoholic substances experimented as fortifying agents?
I couldn't authoritatively answer that. My understanding is that that grape brandies from grape producing. This is not Germany or Canada. We're not producing grain whiskeys, or Scotland. So the grains that are made from wheat and rye and so forth, as far as I know, were never ever used or introduced into the Douro, into the making of port wine. What they had was distilled, fermented grape juice, otherwise known as grape brandy, which in France, of course, is cognac, and can only be, if it must be from cognac to be called cognac, but it is a brandy. Grape brandies are used all over the world, all over the Mediterranean.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay.
All right. Jim Noon asks, who decides a port is vintage? How long will a port hold its quality after it has been opened?
Okay, good questions. There is a council of the leading houses. There's an association of the factory of port makers, and they sit down in the spring and summer, the second year after the wine has been harvested and juice put in barrels, and they decide whether the quality of the wine, the conditions, and whether it's universally was a fabulous year. One usually knows by the weather. You know, late frost would kill things. Too much rain would make wines less than vintage quality. So they sit down and they decide as a group, the Port Lodge Council. How long can vintage go unopened and still retain its quality? After you've opened it, I would say after 3 days you begin to see some diminution, but it's 5 or 6 days. It's still a beautiful wine. This, for example, I opened because I wanted to monitor it and watch it. I opened this on Saturday. This vintage here, which is a 1992 Fonseca. Fonseca is particularly well known. Although they make nice Tawnys, they're particularly well known for their vintage ports and the fruitiness and the bouquet and the richness of the plumminess and of this wine. It's one of those houses that's particularly famous for making vintage ports.
Okay, James Fadley he states, fabulous and informative presentation, Phil. And there's one more on the chat for you. How long will an open vintage or Tawny last? Well, you've already pretty much said
Well,
that.
no. The second question is Tawny.
Tawny,
So,
yeah. How long will that last on the shelf?
Wood ports on the shelf are going to last forever in a bottle. They're going to last forever. And when you open them, they're largely terrific for a couple of months, on your sideboard, like a very good sherry. 6 months you don't want to do, but a couple of months, they're going to hold up beautifully because of the tannic acid level of all that wood that's been imparted into the grape juice.
Okay, that's pretty much it. I've given everybody a chance to ask their questions, Phil. There were a couple others from Charles Lumpkins, but we're at about 6:15, and I'm going to now introduce Karen Karpowitz, our executive director, who will have some comments, and we'll do our closing comments and remarks. Thank you. Thank you, Phil.
Anyway, thank you so much, Phil. It was fascinating. And thank you so much also for the update on the Charlottesville branch. It sounds like some exciting things are going on, and that's nice to share with everyone, to know what's going on there. Thank you again. And Karen, thank you and the committee again for creating a wonderful presentation. I also want to thank two of our new producers this month. I mean, we have Stefan Lebron and also Tony DeFilippo, who's produced this event this evening, and I want to thank them. This is their maiden voyage, and I think they did a wonderful job. Thank you again. I hope to see you all on February 1st, when we're going to be talking about Moby Dick, or the weird Moby Dick, at 4 o'clock, and with Hilary Blum, who is the former head of the Herman Melville Society. So it sounds fascinating and interesting, and a little bit of a turn from what we talked about this evening. But thank you again, and Happy New Year, and hope to see you soon. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.